The Nile, the world's longest river. It flows 6,500 kilometres from the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean.
Wow. This is the Nile.
For thousands of years, explorers have searched for its source.
This is absolutely spectacular.
But all failed.
What could go wrong? Slipping with a machete.
Now, one man is on the cusp of solving one of the world's most elusive mysteries.
Dr. Livingstone, I presume.
Dr. David Livingstone, a man driven to open up the heart of Africa.
Wow. The greatest waterfall in the world.
But hot on Livingstone's heels was a new breed of explorer.
It was the biggest story on the planet.
Now, fellow adventurer Dwayne Fields and I want to understand what drove these extraordinary men.
I don't think he had any idea of what lay ahead of him. The stuff of legend and fable.
In the hunt for one of the world's greatest prizes.
The more we do this, the closer I feel we're getting to the spirit of what Livingstone would have done.
We'll be living like they did, wearing the clothes, eating the food, using the same kit.
Hippo!
This is bloody thick.
Feeling their hunger for fame and glory. The race is on.
So Dwayne and I are out on our Macoros. There's Dwayne Dog there. How are you feeling? You're looking good.
Great. This is a brilliant way to start the day.
Over the past few weeks, we've been reliving Livingstone's pioneering 1854 expedition, when he became the first European to cross the continent.
Livingstone was mapping every single hill, every meander in the river, making the very first detailed maps. We owe a huge amount to him.
And the first European to set eyes on Victoria Falls.
One of the 7 natural wonders of the world.
With Livingstone back in Britain, being hailed a great explorer, stories of his daring deeds have kick-started the race for the world's longest river. 2 army officers, Richard Burton and John Speke, are leading the charge.
This is more of a campaign. It's much more militaristic.
They discovered Lake Tanganyika.
Wow! Oh, look at that. Whoa.
Now we're following the next leg of their journey in search of the source of the Nile.
Back in Europe, this was still a complete mystery, the stuff of legend and fable.
I can tell you now, it's not easy. Burton and Speke and their men were paddling for days and days and days.
In early April 1858, Burton and Speke set off across Lake Tanganyika in search of the Nile.
They were driven by the hope that outlet was there, leading them down the Nile.
Burton had heard rumours of a river at the far north end of the lake called the Ruzizi. He was adamant that this was the start of the Nile. They faced an arduous 175-kilometre paddle that would take nearly 2 months in search of the mysterious river.
These boats are letting in a lot of water, and you can see how low it sits.
We've been paddling for most of the day, and this isn't even half of what they faced as they crossed Lake Tanganyika.
I've got half the lake in here.
I'm going to have to bail out, Ben.
Yeah. Good to carry on?
Yeah.
Burton and Speke were chalk and cheese. Burton was a flamboyant adventurer who'd disguised himself as an Arab so he could sneak into Mecca. He'd raised a few Victorian eyebrows, translating the Kama Sutra. He was determined to claim the prize. Whereas his subordinate, Speke, was an accomplished geographer, best described as dependable, if a bit dour.
Ben, how are your arms?
Yeah, it's okay. It's a very different type of boat to the ones I'm used to.
They'd spent over 8 grueling months crossing Africa, followed by a further 2 months paddling north across Lake Tanganyika.
Now they are within touching distance. This is what everyone has been looking for, the potential source of the Nile.
They were only hours away from possibly finding the Nile when disaster struck.
Nothing could induce him, that's his guide, to take us to the river at the end of the lake. Although the remaining distance could have been accomplished in about 6 hours paddling. 6 hours! After 2 whole months. I mean, that's nothing. His reason was that the savages resident there, the Warundi tribe, were very hostile to his people, the Wajiji. This was a sore disappointment. Understatement! Can you imagine the despondency? I imagine they had already pictured their photograph on the front of all the newspapers, perhaps a knighthood, the Queen coming out and saying, well done. But they'd failed. I suppose they had to go back with their tail between their legs.
And yet, despite the setback, Burton was still adamant that Lake Tanganyika had to be the source of the Nile.
We've paddled 6 hours today. And that's all it would have taken to prove or disprove their theory.
But now Speke had other ideas. He'd heard stories of another, even bigger lake, one that he now believed could be the source. It was the start of a deadly feud between Burton and Speke. It's dawn.
It's hot today.
Dwayne and I are heading deeper into the tropics and lush rainforest.
A lot more humid today.
Yeah.
Do you like this?
It's still early, so that's fine.
On the 9th of July 1858, with Burton resting in the small African town of Kazay, Speke set out on a quick side expedition to look for the mysterious new lake. His journey was to take him over 300 kilometres north to what rumours hinted could be the source of the Nile. With Burton's veiled blessing and limited time, Lieutenant Speke approached this 47-day expedition with military precision.
What do you think about in here somewhere, Dwayne?
I think this is as good as we're going to get.
Speke was a more organised and diligent man than Burton. He and his 34 men followed a strict routine, trekking from before dawn till midday, avoiding the worst of the heat. We're more than happy to follow his lead.
One cooked fowl.
Whoa. Complete with the legs and feet.
Okay.
He always stopped at 9 for a hearty breakfast, prepared by his local cook.
Eggs.
Check if hard-boiled? Yeah.
Boiled eggs.
I think so.
Oh, nice.
That is one giant scone.
Whoa. Oh, it's weighty, isn't it? Mm-hmm. It smells great.
It's almost like they were trying to hold on to some of their Victorian roots, despite being in the heart of East Africa. Teaching the locals how to cook scones. There is something about having a taste from home.
This journey has a very different feel to Burton's large campaign-style expedition. In many ways, it's closer to how we would organise our own trips today.
So I think at this moment, Speke is able to actually be himself, come out of the shadow of Burton.
Had I been Speke, and there's a slight chance, the slightest chance, that I could actually find the source of the Nile at this new inland sea, I'd have grabbed that opportunity, and I think that's exactly what he did. In my mind, Burton thought Speke was onto a fool's errand. He thought he'd go out there and find nothing and come back with his tail between his legs.
All right, what do you think?
I'm getting out my wax cloth.
Waterproof waxed capes like these would have been cutting-edge kit for Victorian explorers. It was like the Gore-Tex of the 19th century.
This is a completely different terrain to what we've had before.
We're deep in virgin rainforest, and like Speak, we're pushing on no matter the conditions. He had a strict deadline, and nothing was going to ruin his chances of finding this new lake.
Slippery underfoot, we don't have particularly good footwear. And we've also got the rain to contend with as well.
Good going, Ben. For the first time, I can understand why it took them so long to make their way across this terrain. You all right there, Ben?
What could go wrong slipping with a machete?
But when Speak found his vast inland lake,
Wow! Look at
my
that!
goodness.
Burton was seething. His second in command was about to eclipse him.
Speak now must have just been grinning like a Cheshire cat.
Dwayne and I are following Lieutenant Speak's small side expedition to find a vast lake rumoured to be bigger than Lake Tanganyika. His commanding officer, Burton, thinks he's on a wild goose chase, but Speak believes it could be the source of the Nile.
Now imagine what Speak is thinking, because he's on the cusp of hopefully getting his first glimpse of this mythical lake.
Now Speak was potentially going to steal all the glory.
There's been a long history that still endures today of sort of one-upmanship on expeditions.
Yeah.
On the face of it, everyone's supporting and championing each other, aren't they? Dwayne,
yeah,
my buddy,
keep going,
my
yeah.
mate, my
Someone
teammate.
is trying to put their foot out there. Get out.
There is. There's a lot of backbiting and rivalry, because there can only ever really be one hero in any specific expedition.
And then, on the 3rd of August 1858, just 25 days after setting off, Speak arrived at the fabled lake.
Wow!
Oh my goodness.
Woohoo! Wow! Woohoo! Look at the size of this.
Lake Victoria, the largest lake in Africa, is 3 times the size of Wales. It's so huge, it creates its own weather.
That is an inland sea. Look at it. Imagine being Speak, seeing this for the first time.
In fact, Speak was the first European to see the lake, and like Livingstone had done at Victoria Falls, he called it Lake Victoria. He too was making a name for himself.
I no longer felt any doubt that the lake at my feet gave birth to that interesting river of the Nile, the source of which had been subject to so much speculation and the object of so many explorers.
Speak's belief was also based on facts. He'd calculated that Victoria was at a higher altitude than Burton's Lake Tanganyika, meaning it was more likely to be the source.
And Speak now must have just been grinning like a Cheshire cat, because it wasn't conclusive proof that this was the source of the Nile yet, but his hunch was right. He had one up on Burton. He'd still have to prove that there was an outlet from this lake.
When Speak arrived back in Britain, claiming that Lake Victoria was the source of the Nile, he was met with adulation, hailed the hero of the hour, and promoted to captain. Burton was fuming. His subordinate had stolen his thunder. Burton was still adamant that Lake Tanganyika was the source. Burton wrote, "It became evident to me that not a word could be uttered upon the subject of the Nile without offence."
Bit more tropical, this, isn't it?
Yeah, there was a time when I was looking forward to having the shade of the trees, but with the trees comes the humidity.
The rift grew as Burton's theory was sidelined, and within months, Speak, now in command, set off to prove Lake Victoria is the source of the Nile. Speke was given the princely sum of £2,500, £250,000 in today's money. He set off from the east coast of Africa with 213 men in late October 1860 on an epic journey. He travelled west before heading north, breaking new ground through often thick, hilly forests as he marched parallel to Lake Victoria for 600 kilometres.
Jungle bashing is just hot, repetitive work, really, and you have to be on your toes, because obviously there's creatures that live in here. Yeah, don't want to disturb the snakes.
Oh, this is heavy work. Look at that. As soon as you shake a leaf, you can see all the flies just dart up, and that's what's going in your face, in your eyes, in your mouth. Sticking to you because of the sweat.
No European had been here before. There were no maps. Speke was crossing uncharted terrain in search of a river that may not even exist. His reputation was on the line.
Yeah, a bit of a steep clamber down here, Dwayne. Right, it might give a bit of a gap between us, just in case one of us takes a full tumble. I think it's controlled descent. Pretty steep, Dwayne.
Oh, yeah. I'm already slipping.
Yeah, watch what you grab onto as well. There's some thorny vegetation down here. Oh, okay. Good job.
But by the beginning of July 1862, after an exhausting 18 months, Speke was finally getting closer.
It's incredibly humid today. I'd hazard a guess like 80%, maybe more. You can see by the sweat on my face how hot it is.
We're following what looks like an animal track, and it comes to a dead end, or it crosses a river that we're not comfortable crossing because there's crocs in there. So then we backtrack, and I just look at Ben's arm. Ben, hold your hand up. Turn it over. That's the reality of where we are right now. What'd you say, Ben? It's like death by 1,000 cuts?
Yeah, yeah, it is. How are you doing?
Mercifully. I think it opens up a little bit.
Great.
We're getting close to the water.
Okay. Is it the Nile?
I can imagine this moment would have been a big one for Speke. He's circled Lake Victoria searching for a massive outlet, and I can hear lots of water rushing, so I'm guessing that sound to him was music to his ears.
Oh, Dwayne!
Oh, Ben, that's a lot of water.
Wow!
That's a lot of white water.
Oh my goodness!
Hippo.
Look at the hippo!
Has Speke found the Nile?
If Speke's right, this is one of the greatest geographical discoveries of all time.
But it would lead to an untimely death
This really is a stinking swamp.
and the return of the great Livingstone.
I don't think he had any idea of what lay ahead of him. That's impressive, isn't it?
On the 21st of July 1862, after trekking more than 1,600 kilometres over 2 years, Speke finally reached the only river that flows out of Lake Victoria.
Imagine being Speke and seeing this.
Oh, yeah.
This is good.
He was certain it was the Nile, and he'd solved the mystery of the source once and for all.
People have been trying to link up the dots for thousands and thousands of years. So if Speke can now establish that this is the Nile, victory is theirs.
Sounds easy enough. But it was to prove anything but.
To confirm it was the Nile, Speke now had to follow this river downstream and connect it to the known Nile, 500 kilometres away. It was still another 6,000 kilometres before it reached the Mediterranean. Speke's journey was far from over.
I know what I would do.
What would you do?
I would basically play a giant game of poo sticks. All he has to do is engrave his name on here, yeah? I mean, why did he not think of it? Throw the stick, and basically, when that... No, don't look at... Don't see it going that way direction. But when that ends up in Cairo, Bob's your uncle.
Speke was so confident that he'd found the source of the Nile. But on the 27th of March, 1862, he sent a telegram back saying the Nile is settled.
But Speke had jumped the gun. Tribal wars along the river prevented him following it all the way. He couldn't prove it 100%. And it didn't take long for his rivals, led by a bitter Richard Burton, to start dismissing his claim. Then, on the 15th of September 1864, tragedy struck. Before Speke could argue his case, he was killed by his own gun whilst out shooting. Burton was quoted, "The charitable say he shot himself, the uncharitable that I shot him." As far as Victorian Britain was concerned, the Nile was still unsolved. There was only one solution: to send the great explorer, the nation's hero, Dr. David Livingstone, back to Africa to solve the mystery once and for all. In 1866, 53-year-old Livingstone set foot onto his beloved Africa once again. His mission sounded simple enough: to prove if the source of the Nile was Burton's Lake Tanganyika or Speke's Lake Victoria. But ahead lay a journey of thousands of kilometres of dry savanna, hot jungles, and vast lakes. He was about to face endless difficulties, but at the start of his new expedition, he had a spring in his step.
Listen to this. Starting on another trip into Africa, I feel quite exhilarated. The mere animal pleasure of travelling in the wild, unexplored country is very great. He loves it here.
I think you must remember that Livingstone was well into his 50s when he came back here. He'd spent the best part of 3 decades exploring this continent and was paying the price for that. You know, he was really weathered by this point. It's the best way to describe it. I don't think he had any idea of what lay ahead of him.
Almost as soon as Livingstone set off, his expedition started to unravel. Many of his porters deserted him, stealing supplies and his medicine chest. He was heading for trouble.
This is bloody thick. There's just no easy way through this. It's going to be a lot of hacking.
In this kind of terrain, it's easy to get a sense of how Africa can turn on you, as it did for Livingstone.
This really is a stinking swamp. You can't smell what we can smell.
Dwayne and I are in the thick of it now. as those early explorers would have been as well.
This was uncharted territory for them. And even though we've got the advantage of knowing what they went through, when you come up against something like this, it's just miserable and it beats your soul.
A lot of people, when they think of the African continent, are very fearful of the lions and the crocodiles and the snakes. But for me, it's the invisible things, the parasites and the disease that are the biggest killer. So many of those early explorers were bedbound for much of their journeys. They didn't have the vaccinations that we have today. But even now, Dwayne and I are pretty vulnerable to all sorts of things that live in this water, in the swamps, that we'll have to have checkups when we go home, because there's certain things you just can't avoid coming into contact with.
The once determined Livingstone was now racked with illness, but refused to give up. He believed he was on a holy mission. "O Father, help me to finish this work to thy honour."
If you look, there's colonies of ants all over the place. And every time you walk past a tree, they fall on you and start biting.
I can feel things wriggling in my trousers.
You can as well.
Yeah. You know what the ants do? They go on you and
Secretly.
they spread out like sleeper cells. And then someone goes, "Ready? Bite!"
Look at the jaws on that
I
thing.
know. That is on my testicles right now. It's really uncomfortable.
Well, it's going to have a tiny meal.
As much as we can laugh about the ants in my pants right now, which is still gnawing on my balls, that's the least of my worries. How hungry are you?
Hungry enough to eat as much as we cook.
By now, Livingstone was eating pretty much anything he could get his hands on. To get closer to his experience, we're having a simple dinner of plain cassava, an African root vegetable.
Livingstone is not in a good place anymore. 3 decades of immersion in the
Pushing his
continent.
body to the absolute limit.
And, suffering illness, disease, multiple injuries along the way. His teeth are falling out. And I think he is realizing that he is falling apart. He's starting to think, I don't know if I'm going to actually make it, let alone solve this puzzle. That's what the hippos think.
Mm-hmm. What a miserable existence that must have been. To go from sumptuous Victorian meals to, well, in this case, a cup of cassava or whatever he could get his hands on.
After 5 years searching for the source of the Nile, the world has lost contact with Livingstone, and rumours spread that the great man is dead. With Livingstone missing in action, a young explorer arrives on the scene, eager to make a name for himself and solve the riddle of the Nile. And we face our biggest challenge yet. Dwayne and I are in the heart of Africa, following Dr. Livingstone's last ill-fated expedition.
This is hard going, it's just a wall of overgrown grasses and roots and vines.
After 5 years in the wilds, Victorian Britain's greatest explorer has gone missing, presumed dead. The world waits with bated breath.
Typhoid, cholera, malaria. Back then, there were explorers that never came back.
A young Welshman steps forward to try and find Livingstone. Enter Henry Morton Stanley.
Oh, this is very pretty, isn't it?
Stanley's expedition was unlike those before. Rather than a journey in search of the Nile, he was funded by the New York Herald newspaper to find the missing great explorer, Livingstone.
It's nice to be out of the slightly thicker jungle.
Stanley had grown up fatherless in a Victorian workhouse, but escaped to America aged 18, where he reinvented himself as a journalist. He was determined to find his hero and make a name for himself. Stanley wrote to his editor, "If alive, you shall hear what he has to say. If dead, I will find him and bring his bones to you." In the spring of 1871, 30-year-old Stanley set off from the east coast of Africa. Like all good journalists, he was following a lead. He'd heard rumours of an old white man living in a village 1,200 kilometres away on the shores of Lake Tanganyika. It would be the adventure of a lifetime.
Oh, look, this is so pretty. I love the colour of this house. Look at the thatch.
After nearly 8 months trekking, Stanley and his caravan neared their destination.
This is Livingstone's last journals. The American flag at the head of a caravan told of the nationality of the stranger. Bales of goods, baths of tin, huge kettles, cooking pots, tents, etc. made me think, this must be a luxurious traveller and not one at his wit's end like me. At this point, Livingstone was effectively homeless. He was begging for food. He was basically a down and out.
It would become one of the most famous meetings in history.
I have a newspaper, the New York Herald, dated July 2nd, 1872. Remember, this is a scoop worldwide. Stanley writes, Livingstone, Herald Special from Central Africa. Finding the great explorer. Can you imagine what that felt like? Dr. Livingstone, I presume, those famous words. Wow. A smile lit up the features of this pale white man as he answered, yes, that is my name.
Isn't that amazing, though, that those words, Dr. Livingstone, I presume,
have stood the test of time?
I mean, incredible.
It was the biggest story on the planet.
Over the next few weeks, the two shared stories as Livingstone regained his health thanks to Stanley's medicines and supplies.
One wanted a friend, that was Livingstone. And then you've got Stanley, who had been longing for a father figure for his whole life.
The duo set off to see if Burton's theory that a river called the Ruzizi at the northern end of Lake Tanganyika was actually the Nile.
It was down to now Stanley and Livingstone to prove Burton right or to prove him wrong. And I guess to a degree, his fate hung in the balance.
They had to paddle 230 kilometres over 26 days to the northern end of the lake to find the river.
This is a pretty exciting, nerve-wracking point in the journey. That final 1% of an expedition where it starts to get really exciting. The big difference for Livingstone and Stanley is that although the end is in sight, they don't know whether that end is success or failure.
In late 1871, Livingstone and Stanley finally reached the river Ruzizi at the very far north of Lake Tanganyika.
When you look at the water now, it's really hard to see which way it's actually moving.
If the Ruzizi flowed out of Tanganyika, then Burton was right.
We've got the lake that way, we've got the river this way.
But if it flowed into Lake Tanganyika, he was wrong.
I'm not sure that Livingstone and Stanley used anything as sophisticated as a flower, but basically, if this flower goes that way, it means that this river is feeding the lake. If it goes that way, then it means the lake is feeding the river. Okay, that is effectively moving the water into the lake. For Livingstone and Stanley, that would have been conclusive proof that this river was feeding the lake, and therefore categorically, emphatically not the source of the Nile. So the race for the Nile is still on.
After 4 months travelling together, and with a heavy heart, Stanley had to leave. He had to file his report about finding Livingstone. He had to share his scoop with the waiting world. But Livingstone stayed on. He was determined to complete his mission.
Ooh, it's floating.
Yeah. Can't stand still too long.
It's amazing, isn't it?
You just start to sink.
Livingstone had been in Africa for 7 years, when, in early 1873, the weather turned. We're entering a swamp to experience firsthand what Livingstone faced as he crossed flooded plains and freezing rivers.
This is a miserable, miserable swamp. You take one step forward, you sink up to your waist. There's just no easy way through this.
We're walking on a thin layer of matted grass. It's floating precariously over deep water. One misstep and we're through.
You can imagine how tough it must have been on Livingstone at his age, with all his ailments, trying to cross this. We're finding it hard. He would have found this impossible. And you guys are just ruining my buoyancy. You've really got to spread your weight.
Oh my gosh. Oh, there's a lot of insects in here. They keep following mosquitoes and getting little bites from things. Goodness knows what.
Livingstone was so ill at this point, he had to be carried. He wrote, "I'm pale, bloodless and weak from bleeding profusely. Oh, how I long to finish my work." To get a sense of what it was like for the porters to carry Livingstone, we're having a go ourselves.
Can you imagine being carried through this, Dwayne?
Oh goodness, it's a miserable resistance. Hang on.
You okay? You okay?
Keep going.
No, it's okay.
It's okay.
It's a big spider. No, it's ice water. Spider, yeah. Right.
Let's go. And up you go.
Let's get you. There we go. That's better.
Livingstone was carried for days as his health deteriorated. We're struggling after minutes.
Okay, I'm going under. Yeah, it's okay. You okay? That was really hard. With an extra weight, your shoulders are being pushed down. You're swallowing spiders and mosquitoes, and I genuinely can't imagine how that was even possible.
The truth is, it's really dangerous out here.
As we near the end of our trip, we're exhausted but still healthy. But for Livingstone, the exhaustion and illness of this expedition proved a step too far. He never recovered from this final African odyssey. One of the last entries in his diary records, was forced to lie down. They carried me back to the village, exhausted. 7 years after he set off to find the source of the Nile, Dr. David Livingstone, one of the world's greatest explorers, died on the 1st of May 1873. He was 60 years old. His body was found at prayer, across his bed in the hut he'd sheltered in.
Can you imagine having not fulfilled that ultimate dream? He had spent 3 decades out in Africa and he never fulfilled his ambition.
To many, Livingstone embodied the heroic ideals of the Victorian era, and his death touched the nation's heart. His body was carried thousands of miles from Africa, and crowds lined the streets of London as a horse-drawn cortege took his body to Westminster Abbey for burial. Even Queen Victoria sent flowers. But while the nation mourned, the game was still on. The source of the Nile was still to be proved. Six months after Livingstone's death, Stanley set out on a new 3-year mission in memory of his mentor. It was the biggest African expedition ever seen.
Stanley, his young protege, plucky journalist, but now seasoned explorer, came out here to try and prove, I think kind of on behalf of his friend, but also for his own fame and glory. Burton's theory has been disproved, and that only leaves Speke's theory that Lake Victoria is the source of the Nile.
Stanley trekked nearly 1,000 kilometres from Zanzibar to Lake Victoria. He circumnavigated the lake and proved that there is only one river flowing out at Ripon Falls, the Nile. His discoveries finally connected all the dots and proved the source once and for all.
16 years after Speke claimed Lake Victoria was the source of the Nile, he was finally proven right.
Stanley spent another 2 years exploring Africa, but for us, our journey ends here, near the start of the Nile, close to Lake Victoria.
Wow. 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 This is the Nile. This is absolutely spectacular.
You can almost feel it shaking, vibrating the rocks underneath our feet.
For Dwayne and I, this has been an incredible journey.
Everything on the Nile is on a grand scale. It has to start big, and there is no denying that this is huge.
I think for those early explorers, they must have just been blown away by this.
We've experienced firsthand some of what those explorers endured in their heroic quest.
Dwayne and I have sweated and cut and chopped and swam and yomped our way across East and Central Africa. And it's taken its toll, I'm pretty tired, if I'm to be honest. But now at this point, I feel a surge of energy. But the river carries on. This has been going for thousands and thousands of years.
Yes, those explorers, Burton, Speke, Stanley and Livingstone, had faults. And the legacy of their journeys was to have a massive and often tragic impact on Africa. But they also succeeded where so many had failed before. And that is an incredible achievement.
Dwayne, should we do one thing that none of those Victorian explorers could have done?
What are you going to do then? It's been a good journey.
It's been amazing.